Good morning. I'm Jim Perkins, and I welcome you to the third presentation of the Spring 2014 OLLI program series, Foreign Cultures and American Foreign Policy. The objective of this OLLI program is to inform participants about foreign cultures and how they affect the country's behavior, and how that knowledge can create an enlightened American foreign policy. It's my pleasure today and honor to introduce Dr. William B. Quandt, who has spoken on this program in 2012 and 2013 on Egypt. Today, Professor Quandt will tell us about Turkey. Professor Quandt is the Edward R. Stettinius Professor Emeritus of the Department of Politics at the University of Virginia. After serving 19 years here at UVA, Professor Quandt retired in July 2013. As the chair of that department, a post he had held since he had joined UVA in 1994. And he succeeded Professor Rui Ramazani, who, as you know, helped me establish this program, Foreign Cultures and American Foreign Policy. Dr. Quandt was born in Los Angeles, California. He received his BA in International Relations from Stanford University and his PhD in Political Science from MIT. Dr. Quandt was also an associate professor of political science at the University of Pennsylvania. He worked at the RAND Corporation in the Department of Social Science from 1968 to 1972 and taught at UCLA and at MIT. From 2000 to 2003, he also served as vice provost for international affairs at the University of Virginia. He taught courses on the Middle East and American foreign policy. Prior to this appointment, he was a senior fellow in the Foreign Policy Studies program at the Brookings Institution, where he conducted research on the Middle East, American policy toward the Arab-Israeli conflict, and energy policy. William Quandt has written numerous books, and his articles have appeared in a wide variety of publications. Two of his books include Peace Process, American Diplomacy and the Arab-Israeli Conflict since 1967, and The United States and Egypt, an essay on policy for the 1990s, published by Brookings. He is a member of the Council on Foreign Relations and serves on the Board of Trustees of the American University of Cairo. In 2004, he was elected to the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, and in 2005, he received the All-American Teaching Award at the University of Virginia. In October 2012, UVA President Sullivan lauded veteran Professor William B. Quandt as a model for both his students and colleagues. She stated, and I quote, "He is a visionary scholar, a celebrated teacher, and a distinguished diplomat," unquote. He was awarded the highest honor that the University of Virginia has to offer, the Thomas Jefferson Award. After retiring, Professor Quandt has been very active, traveling last year to both Egypt and Turkey, keeping abreast of events there. He also is currently serving on the board of the Foundation for Middle East Peace in Washington, D.C. Established in 1979 by the late Merle Thorpe, Jr., the foundation is dedicated to promoting, through various activities, a just solution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict that brings peace and security to both peoples. He is the nation's preeminent expert on the Arab-Israeli peace process. Before going to Brookings in 1979, Dr. Quandt served as a senior staff member on the National Security Council from 72 to 74 and again 1977 to 1979. He was actively involved under President Jimmy Carter in the 78-79 negotiations that led to the Camp David Accord and the Egyptian-Israeli Peace Treaty. And here's a very interesting latest development in these events. Just this month, April 2014, the new historical drama, Camp David, by Pulitzer Prize winner Lawrence Wright, opened in Washington, D.C. The play, Camp David, retraces the 1978 peace accord and is the story of how Jimmy Carter, Menachem Begin, and Anwar Sadat came together to forge a treaty between Israel and Egypt that has endured long after their passing from power. This is a play about leadership and sacrifice and what it takes to make peace. Dr. Quandt was invited to attend the world premiere red carpet performance of Camp David on April 3rd. President Jimmy Carter and his wife Rosalind attended that same night and served as the honorary chairs of the red carpet premiere of Camp David, and Dr. Quandt was there. Please welcome our distinguished guest, Dr. William B. Quandt.
Thank you. Thank you, Jim, for that very generous introduction, most of which was, I guess, true, perhaps slightly editorialized. But I'm very pleased to be here. This is the third time I've had a chance to speak with this group, and I've always found it a well-informed and interesting audience to interact with, so I will try to avoid the normal professorial problem of talking on and on at you, although you're going to get a little bit of talking too. And we'll try to leave a good bit of time for discussion at the end. Just in order to satisfy my curiosity, I'd like to know how many of you have ever been to Turkey? Oh, that's great. That looks like almost 30–40% of the audience. That's good for a lot of reasons, because it means that some of you will have a good bit of knowledge that you can perhaps share with us. The questions you have will be rooted in your own experiences there, and you'll have a sense of this interesting country that I'm going to try to give you a little bit of an understanding of as best I can. Now, Turkey is a large and complicated country. You can see from its geography that it is surrounded by regions that right now are in considerable turmoil. To its south, Syria is in full-scale civil war. Iraq, also to its south, isn't a whole lot better off. Iran on its eastern edge is also a source of considerable tension in the region. Black Sea is to its north, and just at the top of the Black Sea, of course, is Ukraine, which is going through its crisis, and so forth and so on. In this particular region, Turkey stands out not as a model of stability and democracy and everything going perfectly well, but comparatively speaking, Turkey's doing all right, better than all right. It's, for the past decade, done, in fact, quite well economically, pretty well politically, but it is also a country that is being affected by some of the regional tensions and by the kind of growing pains of perhaps a democracy that is still struggling to consolidate itself. So what I'm going to try to do today is give you a bit of historical background. I don't think we can jump straight into contemporary Turkish politics without setting the stage a little bit. This is perhaps the academic's fault of always wanting to sort of see what precedes what I really want to talk to you about, but I do think it's impossible to look at contemporary Turkey without a certain number of historical markers along the way, and a few names that some of them will stick in your mind, some of them won't, but these are people and events that I think are the building blocks for an understanding of contemporary Turkey. So it's not going to be a very thorough or complete history that I give you. We don't have time for that, and that's not why you came. But I do want to give you some of the highlights. And we're going to start with the moment that many contemporary Turks would still look back to as the kind of high point of civilization for Turkey at a time when it was the center of a great empire, perhaps one of the greatest empires ever, and certainly in its day. This is the map, more or less, of the Ottoman Empire in the 16th century. The only rival it would have had in the world would have been the Chinese Empire. Europe, by contrast, was something of a still emerging. Within a relatively short period, it begins to overtake the Ottomans. But at this particular moment in time, there's no question that the Ottomans are among the great imperial systems of the world. Just look at the geographical extent of the Ottoman Empire at its, this is more or less at its peak. This is under the rule of a ruler called Suleiman the Magnificent. We'll see a picture of him in a moment, or Suleiman the Lawgiver. And at this time, growing out of its Turkish base, the Ottoman dynasty, which had come to power in the late 14th century. This is now, we're a couple of hundred years into the Ottoman period, which the empire lasts for 600 years. It's not a short-lived phenomenon. Most empires don't last that long. This one did. By its peak under Suleiman, the Ottomans had reached the outskirts of Vienna. In fact, on 2 occasions, the Ottomans came close to conquering Vienna. And had they done so, the history of Western Europe would have been dramatically different. But they never got beyond Vienna, but they did control all of the Balkans area, Greece, on up into what is present-day actually Ukraine. The part just at the top of the Black Sea, that's today's Ukraine. So when you hear about the current crisis in Ukraine and Kiev, and people are talking about the Maidan, Maidan is a Turkish Arabic word for the square. The Maidan Tahrir is the same one in Cairo. That means the same thing, Tahrir Square. So I kind of wondered in my mind why they were calling the square in Kiev, where all these demonstrations were taking place, by a Turkish Arab word. Well, of course, the reason has to do with the hundreds of years that Turks controlled this part of the world. And in the Middle East, the Ottoman Empire went right up to today's border with Iran. Iran was always just beyond the reach of the Ottomans, but in today's geographical terms, the states of Iraq and Syria, Lebanon, Israel, Palestine, Egypt, on down to part of Saudi Arabia as far as Yemen and the Arabian Peninsula, and then across North Africa through Libya, Tunisia, and Algeria. This was all under Ottoman control. Ottomans never conquered Morocco. By the time the Ottomans were rising, Islamic rule in Spain was declining, so they never had any foothold in Spain either. But it's a pretty huge geographical swatch. Let me just give you a little sense of what it was like in this period when Suleiman was at his peak. And his contemporary was the King of France, Francis I, who had been captured by the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V, I believe, and had smuggled out a letter to Suleiman asking for Suleiman's help to free him and offering all kinds of things in return. So the letter that Suleiman writes back to him starts as follows. I, Sultan of Sultans, King of Kings, the shadow of God who bestows the crown to the monarchs on earth, the supreme ruler of the Mediterranean and the Black Seas, the Balkans and Anatolia, Azerbaijan, Damascus, and Halep, that's Aleppo, Egypt, Mecca, and Medina, Jerusalem and all of the Arabian dominions, and Yemen, and the Sultan and the Supreme King of many nations. I am the son of Sultan Selim Khan and grandson of Sultan Bayezid Khan, and you, King Francis, are the governor of the French province. Gives you a little idea of the perception, at least, of who has the upper hand. And he's certainly got the better hat of the two of them. This is the actual letter on the left side that contains all of that flowery language, and the signature, which is, of course, highly artistic, but that is Suleiman's signature on the right. So at this moment, the Ottoman Turks thought of themselves as the center of a very large empire, if not the center of the world. And this was an explicitly Islamic state, but not a state only of Muslims. It was an interesting moment when, although Muslims were privileged, and Sunni Muslims in particular, not Shia. The Shia were predominantly in Iran. That's where the border between the Ottomans and Iran was also the border largely between the Sunni world, which is the mainstream part of the Islamic world, and the Shia, who are the other faction of Islam. Sunnis were the dominant ruling caste, but there were also many Christians and Jews who participated certainly in economic life and political life. And this was a period when within the Ottoman Empire there were large minority communities of Greeks, Armenians, Jews, Christians, who basically were given the right to run their own affairs. If you've ever been to many of the old cities of the Ottoman era, you will see that they were often organized around areas where the Christians would live here, and the Jews would live here, and the Muslims would live here. There would be kind of geographical proximity, but not a whole lot of mixing. And within those communities that would live more or less together, by and large, they would live under their own laws and have their own schools. And the Ottoman Empire provided an overlay of kind of law and order, but not a lot of day-to-day governance. And the further you were from the center, the more local rulers would have considerable influence. But in its day, the Ottomans created remarkable monuments. If you've been to Istanbul, one of the great mosques there, and there are many that you will see, was built for Suleiman, the great ruler, and it stands today actually just having gone through a renovation for the past decade or so as a remarkable monument of the architecture of one of the great architects of the Ottoman period, a man named Sinan, who was actually himself of Christian origin, not unusual, who then was brought into the palace school, converted to Islam, and became one of the great architects for the sultans of his day. This is probably his greatest monument. Good reminder to everybody else to turn them off. So one of the things to think about for our understanding of modern-day Turkey is the theme that has emerged in recent years in Turkey, that Turkey as an emerging strong power in the Middle East has a special kind of vocation to reconnect with some of these parts of its old empire. Not in the same way of ruling them or dominating them or governing them, but because of cultural similarities. These are Muslim countries, and because today's Turkey is a relatively successful country in economic terms, that it has a kind of special role to play. Now, that hasn't actually worked out quite as easily or as well as certain people had hoped, particularly the Prime Minister of Turkey. Sometimes people have detected a kind of neo-Ottomanist tone in his discourse, that he imagines that Turkey can recover some of this larger-than-life-size role. I think it's probably not terribly realistic, but what is striking, to me at least as a visitor to Turkey over the years, is the extent to which Turkey is now a destination for tourism from countries like Egypt, Algeria, even Iraq. Middle-class people who want to go visit a country that they find interesting, relatively tolerant, with fabulous food and great historical monuments, flock to Turkey. In fact, they have tens of millions of tourists, and they're not all Americans or Europeans. There are many, many Middle Easterners who go to see what Islamic civilization at its high point looked like. And I'll tell you, they come back pretty impressed. The streets are relatively clean. There's public transportation. The city mostly works, except when the traffic jams are overwhelming. And compared to, say, Cairo or Baghdad or places that are deeply troubled right now, it's a relatively safe and increasingly prosperous country. So in some sense, Turkey has become a kind of model. Not that others in the Middle East want Turkey to rule them. Those days are over. But many of them look and say, if we could be like Turkey in 10 or 15 years, that would be a pretty good success. So what I'm going to try to do is give you a few general themes to think about as we talk through some of contemporary Turkish history. And I want you to try to bear in mind what seem to be perhaps alternative ways of thinking about Turkey, but themes that perhaps have to be kind of brought together. That Turkey is both in many ways a very modern country. If you were to go certainly to Istanbul or to Ankara, the main cities, it has a kind of European and modern feel to it. You would see the infrastructure of a modern country. You'd see skyscrapers, you'd see architecture that was reminiscent of some of the most modern architecture you could imagine seeing in this country or anywhere in Europe. You would see the same kind of traffic jams. You would see people who look in certain parts of the city very much like other Europeans in dress and otherwise. But you would also very quickly be aware that you were also in a Muslim country. If you went into other neighborhoods, you would see all of the women probably wearing headscarves. If you look at the skyline, which you need to do in a place like Istanbul because it's beautiful, but you would see these incredible mosques that just dot every hilltop. And so you would very quickly be aware that you were in a country that was, on the one hand, quite westernized, but at the same time with deep roots in its Islamic past. And then the more you explore, you would see it's not just the Islamic past, but there's also a Byzantine past, there's a Roman past, and there are just these layers and layers and layers. And in some parts of the city of Istanbul, you can see all of those layers just piled on top of one another. That's what makes it such an interesting city to visit for people like me who like to see how different cultures build on top of one another. And quite literally, you see it in a place like Istanbul. Another theme for understanding Turkey, certainly since World War II, is that there has been a real struggle that has gone on in this society between a kind of aspiration to adopt the institutions and the practices of democracy, and they've done pretty well. But democracy doesn't go in a straight line. We'll talk about some of the bumps along the road. And every now and then, this democratic impulse has been interrupted by usually military interventions that have put an end to one democratic experiment, perhaps rewritten the Constitution, and then the system goes back to trying once again to get back on track with elections and multi-party systems and so forth. And we'll want to talk about this kind of bumpy transition from authoritarianism to democracy with interludes of real return to authoritarianism. And it's not over yet, although Turkey has been on a pretty democratic track for the last 15 years or so, or even more than that. The concern on the part of many Turks today is that the current prime minister, who is actually quite popular, has an authoritarian streak that is beginning to manifest itself. And if you've followed the news at all in the last year or so, you will see that those concerns have grown quite significantly and have led to some political violence in the last year. Another thing that has to be kind of sorted out in an understanding of Turkey is that on the one hand, Turks, modern day Turks, are very nationalistic. Many of them very proud of their country. Not surprisingly, many people around the world are. But this is also a country that still has within it minorities that have not been fully integrated into the Turkish national narrative, most particularly the Kurdish minority, which probably makes up somewhere between 10 and 20% of the population and has been sort of a thorn in the side of Turkish nationalists for a long time. They are fellow Muslims, but they speak a different language. And in the early nationalist phase of nation formation, the Turks pretty much denied that there even was a Kurdish people. They tended to talk about them as just kind of backward, rural Turks who spoke a funny variation of Turkish, which is not at all true. Kurdish is a distinctive language, but they denied them their cultural and linguistic rights and treated them as sort of marginal to the Turkish story. That's beginning to change. We'll talk a little bit about that, but it is not by any means a story that has been fully resolved. I mentioned the European and Middle Eastern legacies. I won't say more about that. And then the last theme I would mention is that Turkey as a modern state, and we'll talk a moment about how it became a modern state, is largely the project of a relatively small, urban, to some extent westernized, and initially secular elite that set out to make modern Turkey as a modern secular state. It didn't set out to interrogate Turkish public opinion and say, what kind of state do you want? It set out to tell them what kind of state they should have. It was very much a top-down elite project, product of a very impressive and powerful political leader named Mustafa Kemal Ataturk, about whom I will tell you a bit more later. But as Turkey developed, and as education spread, and as urbanization took place, and as democracy was experimented with, the voice of ordinary Turks carried more and more weight. And one of the things that came across as people went to vote is that they didn't always agree with what they had been told they were supposed to believe by their urban, elite, Europeanized, secular state founders. And that's part of the tension that still exists in Turkey. If you look at a map of voting in Turkey, you can predict almost always that the Islamic parties win the countryside. They win overwhelmingly in the countryside. And the more secular, westernized parties, the parties that are the descendants of this elite that founded the state, win in Istanbul and a few other urban areas and along the kind of Mediterranean coast. So these are tensions that continue. Let me just go back to my slide of the map here. Modern Turkey is the product of the collapse of what had remained of the Ottoman Empire in World War I. The Ottoman Empire was still not with these borders. Western imperialism and colonialism had already eaten away at a good bit of this. Defeats on the battlefield had driven the Ottomans back out of certainly most of the European areas. But a good bit of the Middle East was still under Ottoman control at the end of the 19th century. You can still find a few people alive in the Middle East today, although they're getting to be a little bit old, who were born in the Ottoman Empire. You have to be about 95 years old to have qualified for that, but when I got started in this business, you would still find people who were elderly but still quite active and who would say, yes, I was born in the Ottoman Empire. I happen to be from Syria or from Iraq or from Palestine, but I was born as an Ottoman subject. So what happened? Well, the Ottomans had to choose which side, if any, to join in World War I. Their main adversary at the time was the British, who had taken Egypt from them and the French earlier, but mainly the British, who had taken Egypt from them, which was a big part of the Ottoman Empire, in 1880. And so the Ottomans made the strategic choice to align themselves with Germany in World War I. It turned out to be a bad choice. You couldn't tell at the outset of that war who was going to win. Many people thought the Germans would, but they didn't. And as a result, the French and the British, as the World War I came to an end, one of the things they started thinking about was, what do we do with the Ottoman lands when the war is over and we win? How are we going to divide them up? And they basically reached the following broad outline, that the British would have predominant sway in Palestine and Iraq, giving them a land bridge across the Middle East. That would be their sphere of influence. Present-day Israel, Palestine, Jordan, Iraq would come under their control. The French would have control over Lebanon and Syria as their zone of influence. And Turkey, what remained of what we think of as present-day Turkey, would be basically broken down into little bits. The Greeks would get the Mediterranean coastal area. French and Italians would have influence over parts of it. And there might be a little remnant left that would be under Turkish control, but basically they would just dismember not only the Arab parts of the Ottoman Empire, but heartland Turkey itself. Modern Turkey, and there was a treaty signed with the last of the Ottoman sultans called the Treaty of Sèvres, which imposed these very draconian terms on Turkey as a defeated power. Many Turks were horrified about the fate that awaited them, including that a good part of the western part of heartland Turkey would be turned over to the Greeks, who sent an invading army to take over the part they were promised by the Allies. So some of the officers who had fought in the Ottoman army decided to take up arms and to fight back against the dismemberment of their country. And one of these officers was Mustafa Kemal Ataturk. He had been an Ottoman officer who had fought in the Battle of Gallipoli. You've probably heard of that. This is where the Australian forces came as allies of the British, fought quite valiantly, but ultimately were defeated, and largely defeated because of this officer who led the Ottoman and Turkish forces there. So Ataturk organizes from the hinterland of Turkey an army designed to fight against the terms of the Treaty of Sèvres. And the main force to fight against, since neither the British nor the French wanted to send troops into Turkey, but the Greeks did. The Greeks were occupying the western part of the country. Ataturk ended up fighting for Turkey's independence against Greek forces that had been encouraged and supported by the victorious allies. And the Turkish forces were successful in driving the Greeks out. It wasn't very pleasant. There was a lot of violence. And it meant that the remaining Greek communities in Turkey were viewed, of course, as enemies. And this was a time when a huge population exchange took place. Turks living in what was Greece were expelled back to heartland Turkey, and Greeks living in Turkey were expelled to Greece proper. This was called a population exchange, but it did great violence to a lot of people's lives. It also meant that Turkey emerged as a much more homogeneous country after World War I, including the terrible things that were done to the Armenians during that period, than it had been during the Ottoman Empire, when it was a much more multicultural and multi-ethnic mixture. So Ataturk in 1923 finally signs a new treaty. It's called the Treaty of Lausanne, which recognizes the new Turkish Republic, essentially in the boundaries that I showed you in the very first slide. This is no longer as big as the Ottoman Empire, but it represents the basic core Turkish homeland that was the core of power for the Ottomans. And Ataturk makes a crucial judgment. He is an interesting character. He was born in the European part of the Ottoman Empire, today in Greece, in Thrace, but became identified very strongly with Turkish nationalism, but also thought that for Turkey to survive, it needed to mimic what he saw as the best qualities of what Western nations had done. It had to modernize itself. It had to break off the shackles of religion, as he saw it, a backward force. It had to get rid of the sultan and the caliph, all these things that he attributed to Turkey's backwardness. And it had to adopt even a new alphabet. The slide on the right is a picture of Ataturk introducing a Roman alphabet that he said would be easier for Turks to use to learn their own language. Turkish had been written in Arabic script forever. And if you go back and look at any 19th century documents from Turkey, they're all in Arabic script. Arabic is phonetic, so you can write any language in it. But he said it was better to use a Roman script. By doing this, he was also saying to Turks, forget about the past. I don't want you to read those dusty old manuscripts written in Ottoman Turkish. I want you to think of yourself not as Ottomans anymore. I don't particularly even want you to think of yourselves as Muslims anymore, although I'm not going to force you to change that. I want you to think of yourself as Turks. And Turk will mean something different than it has ever meant before. Turk was a somewhat pejorative term meaning kind of rural bumpkin peasant. He said that, no, it's a word that describes a proud people with its own language, its own culture. So this is a real attempt to remake a people's national identity. And there's no doubt he was charismatic. He had a strong personality. He could stand up and speak for 7 hours with no notes, and people were just mesmerized by him. He once gave a speech in the Parliament, which was called the 7-day speech. Eventually, you'd have to, have occasional breaks and go home at night, but he would come right back the next day, and it was almost as if I am going to make you believe in this project until you finally say, okay, we give up, we accept. And you can notice his dress. He's wearing a necktie. He's wearing the hat is Russian, so don't think of that as a fez. It's not Muslim. It's a Russian Astrakhan cap. He's wearing a tuxedo. He's presenting himself as a modern man to make a modern state. And he put forward as the principles of this modern state that it should be a republic. You got the Sultanate and the Caliphate were abolished, which for conservative Muslim sensibility was a dramatic thing to do. Think of it, a 600-year-old empire ceases to exist. Some people thought this was wonderful. A lot of people thought it was going too far. But in his lifetime, few people challenged him. He also said that it should be a secular state. The state would not seek to impose religion, any particular religion on the people, although 90+% of the population was Muslim. And secularism did not quite mean division of church and state the way it does in our thinking. It was more that the state will dominate, the church will not dominate the state. The religious authorities will take their orders from the state. That's what secularism meant. It's also kind of what secularism means in France, if you've ever noticed. They teach religion in the schools in France. They teach religion in the schools in Turkey, but it's the way the state wants to interpret it. That's a big change. And he also said the state should play a big role in the economy. We need to build infrastructure. We need to build railways. We need to build telegraph lines, all the infrastructure of modernization that you think of today, and industrialization, and so forth. So Ataturk, the first phase of Turkey's modern development that you need to know about is about the first 20 years or so. From the founding of the Republic in 1923 to about the end of World War I represents this kind of phase of state building, top-down, westernization. They had actually adopt the Swiss legal code as their legal code. They just changed the word Switzerland to Turkey and make a few adjustments. They don't use Sharia law, anything like that. They just use modern Western standards. And Ataturk makes one other decision. He says, we're not going to try to reconquer any of the lost empire. What's gone is gone. And if we try to do that, we will get ourselves embroiled in international problems with more powerful countries. There's Russia to our north, there are the British in the Arab world, there are the French in Syria. And if we're going to survive, we have to focus on building a strong modern state in Turkey. But no foreign adventures. His phrase was, peace at home, peace abroad. Nonetheless, he built a strong army. The army was the backbone of the state. He was a military officer. And as much as he talked about Turkey being a republic, and in his own mind, he thought of it as having a democratic future, probably. He ran it like his own personal state. What he said was going to be done. So in many ways, he was a military authoritarian leader who talked a language of republicanism and secularism and eventually democracy, but it was a pretty tough place if you disagreed with what Ataturk thought. There were opposition parties that were allowed to form, but as soon as they expressed any opposition, he would ban them. He was very intolerant in practice. Nonetheless, in today's Turkey, where he and his party are no longer held in universally high regard, although for a long time, if you met a Turkish student at UVA, Ataturk was still venerated. They were the generation that grew up in the secular schools that were taught that this guy was godlike. That's a little less true today, although you will still find a lot of people who look to him as the founder and with a lot of reverence. So Ataturk establishes his sway for the first 10 or so years of, he's very active, he's still in good health, and he puts his imprint on the state. He creates a political party. He realizes that there's a need to envisage how to create institutions that will outlast him. He's very aware that modern states need modern institutions. So he creates a political party. There had never been anything called political parties in Turkey. We usually see it referred to as the Republican People's Party. There is still a Republican People's Party. It's the second largest party in the country now. He created a parliament. There have always been parliamentary elections, not always been a very powerful institution, but year after year it functions, and periodically every four or 5 years there are parliamentary elections. And it has created a place where politics takes place. It's not the only place, but it has in fact played an important role. And of course he created a presidency. He became the first president of the republic, and sometimes the president, sometimes the prime minister is the stronger figure, but there are these institutionalized positions that still exist today. Most of the formal framework of the Turkish Republic today was put in place by Ataturk. The constitution's been changed and amended, but the formal structure is still pretty much there. The one other thing, as I mentioned, is that because he was a military man and he gave great priority to building up a strong, modern military, the military thought of itself in his day and since, although less so today, as being something of the guardian of the institutions of this new state, and in some ways being kind of above the political order, as if, politicians are allowed to play their games as long as they don't put the state at risk. But if we in the military ever decide that they've gone too far, we'll have the right to step in and correct things. So the military had a kind of guardian role in its own mind, and it was legitimized by Ataturk himself, that, who had been the state creator and the one who had created the modern military. So this story comes back into focus after the transition to democracy. Now, Ataturk in his lifetime, by the end, he was in poor health, he was drinking too much, he lived a pretty libertine life. That was all kind of hushed up so that most people don't even talk about it today. But fortunately, he had recruited a deputy who was much less colorful, much less charismatic. Most people would not recognize a picture of him today, but it was a man named İsmet İnönü. And İnönü was the deputy head of the party. Ataturk dies in 1938, I believe it was, and İnönü seamlessly steps in, becomes the second president of the republic, and presides for the next 12 years. And this is a very crucial period because, as you can see from the dates, World War II breaks out 1 year after İnönü comes to power. And he decides not to make the same mistake that the Ottomans made in World War I. Don't take sides. In fact, until you're pretty sure who's going to win, don't even express any sympathies. So Turkey essentially remains neutral through most of the war. By the end, of course, it sees which way things are going, and it sides with the victorious Allies, and emerges on good terms in 1945-46 with the new guardians of the New World Order, namely the United States, and on not bad terms with Russia initially, but it ends up on quite good terms with the United States. And within a few years, by 1949, 1950, if I recall correctly, Turkey becomes the only Middle East country that joins NATO and has been a loyal NATO member ever since 1949-50, and in fact sent Turkish soldiers to fight in the Korean War. So Turkey stays out of the war, but then joins the winning side afterwards and gets that kind of protection from the United States against Russian pressures, of which there were some. In fact, some people described one of the earliest crises of the post-World War II period, of the Cold War period, is Truman's response to Russian pressures on Turkey, which led to the Truman Doctrine, which was that we would support countries like Turkey that were standing up to communist pressures. And that led to incorporating them into NATO a couple of years later. Turkey became eligible for aid under the Marshall Plan as well, because it was seen as this kind of an extension of Europe. So this is the beginning of Turkey being brought in to the American-European security network. And it has a huge impact. Among other things, I think Inonu intelligently understands that if Turkey is going to be an appealing partner for the Americans and the Europeans, it needs to not only be modern and secular, it also needs to live up to its democratic pretensions. And so he decides, quite remarkably, in 1945, to allow multi-party elections. And his party, Ataturk's party, wins them. But for the first time, you see the emergence of opposition. And it takes the form of more conservative, rural people saying, you've gone too far, and you're ignoring what ordinary Turks still believe. We're still Muslims. We're still, small shopkeepers. We're still traders. We want the state not to always be bossing us around. It was their Tea Party. It wasn't quite as fanatic as our Tea Party, but it's the kind of reaction to too much big government telling us what to do all the time, and we need to be more attentive to what people in our local communities are saying and feeling and their traditions and so forth and so on. So there's some of that begins to express itself. And in 1945, 46, Inonu has another election. In 1950, he has another election to contest in this atmosphere of growing political contestation. Part of his own party has split away and formed something called the Democratic Party. Inonu, to his credit, goes to the polls. A genuinely democratic election is held. Not very many of those in the part of the world that I study, the Middle East. And the Republican People's Party is decisively defeated. The Democratic Party, which is more rural, more conservative, more free enterprise, clobbers these elitists. This is the kind of revenge of the masses who had been ignored and patronized and told what to do and all the rest. And they finally get their revenge by electing a new government. And the military doesn't intervene. Inonu doesn't cancel the elections. Instead, he accepts the results. And a man named Adnan Menderes is the first elected. He becomes prime minister, which is the newly powerful position in Turkey for the next decade. And this is a period of a great deal of political contestation. A lot of Turks who had identified with the Ataturk project began to get very worried that Menderes was taking the country back toward more role for religion, more role for more traditional forces. And so you saw a lot of very intense politics going on in the 1950s. That's kind of what happens in new democracies. You have one election and it brings into play a whole new set of forces, and then the old forces fight back. And by the end of the 1950s, the country was on the verge of a real explosion of political violence. And at that point, the military senses that this man, Menderes, is seeking to undermine the role of the military. Inonu is out campaigning, and Menderes tries to stop him from being able to speak. And the military decides in 1960 to carry out the first military coup d'etat. They simply say, democracy hasn't worked, it's gotten out of hand. It's a little bit like what you hear General Sisi saying in Egypt today, that we tried democracy, it didn't work too well, it's time to go back to the drawing board, new constitution, and so forth. So all of this happens in 1960 with the military stepping in. Menderes is actually convicted of treason and is hanged. Again, a little reminiscent of what Sisi's saying about the Muslim Brethren today, that they were traitors, and they, forgetting that they were also elected. Very much the same thing. Menderes is hanged, and the military writes a new constitution and essentially says, we'll try again under the new rules, and for the next decade, political parties had to change their names. But by and large, in the 1970s, the experiment at kind of getting things back on track didn't work terribly well. You got a fairly strong leftist movement, fairly strong conservative movement, and once again, a lot of violence began, including some in the Kurdish areas. So in 1980, a second coup d'etat took place. This was a very important moment in Turkish history. The military stepped in once again and said, we're going to once again rewrite the rules, and we're going to say what's acceptable and what's not acceptable. And within 2 or 3 years, they allowed political parties to reform with a new set of rules, a new constitution, which is essentially still the constitution that governs the country today, with a lot of special privileges set aside for the military. Again, very much what's happening in Egypt today. The constitution was written to give privileges to the military that we would be horrified to see in a democratic constitution. But that's what happened in Turkey. And so in the 1980s, another, not necessarily a man you need to remember, but Turks who talk about their transition to democracy and development will say he played a very big role. He became the prime minister for the period of the 1980s, and he came out of a kind of center-right tradition. This is a period when Turkey for the next 10 or 15 years is dominated by, I think, what correctly could be described as kind of center-right governments. They don't break with Ataturk's model, but they say we need to try more free enterprise. The state shouldn't play as dominant a role in the economy. We need to allow a little bit more diversity within the society. And to allow Islam to express itself in a moderate way. Özal also had Kurdish ancestry, which helped him, I think, address the Kurdish issue with a bit more credibility. So the Kurdish issue was a little bit less intense during this period. And he began to carry out economic reforms that gave quite a bit of encouragement to local entrepreneurs. And Turkey begins to get a little spurt of economic growth. And economic growth helps in the world of politics. If everybody's feeling that things are getting a little bit better, it's an awful lot easier to govern than it is in periods of sharp economic decline. So the late 1980s begins to see a period of considerable economic improvement. There have been some real problems in Turkey's economy in the earlier period. Things begin to get considerably better. I'm going to skip over that. So we just briefly I'll leave that up there if you want to skim through it. During the 1990s, and then we're going to get to the present in a moment, 1990s is an interesting kind of transition where you still have these kind of center-right parties. In order to govern, they need an alliance partner in crucial elections in the 1990s. And one of the new parties that has emerged is an Islamist party. It's not very different, probably, from the Muslim Brethren in Egypt. It talks about Islamic political values, but it says it will play by the rules of the democratic game. And I think it was in 1993, a crucial election, two center-right parties split, and each of them got about 20% of the vote, and the Islamist party got 20% of the vote. So it became a real game of who's going to align with whom in order to get the crucial number of seats in the parliament in order to govern. And it actually turned out to be a very unstable period, because every time a government would form, it would just take the defection of a few members of parliament to shift the balance to a different coalition. Eventually, this resulted in the mid-1990s in an Islamist prime minister coming to power. Elected, democratic, not the current prime minister, but his predecessor, a man named Erbakan. And Erbakan was, if you want an analogy, probably a little bit like, thought we had those all turned off. It was a little bit like perhaps Morsi in Egypt. He took his Islamic values seriously, he talked a lot about them, scared a lot of more secular Turks, just as Morsi scared a lot of more secular Egyptians. And in 1997, we had the last of these Turkish military threats to intervene. This time, however, and this is perhaps a sign of the times, the tanks didn't go into the streets. Instead, it was called a virtual coup. They sent literally a fax to the prime minister saying that unless you do the following 15 things, we will exercise our right to protect the integrity of the state, something like that. And it resulted in the non-Islamist parties who were coalition partners with the Islamist prime minister breaking their coalition agreement and agreeing to form a non-Islamist government. But in the 1990s, there was this brief experiment in secular Turkey of a prime minister coming out of an avowedly Islamist background, and the military put an end to it. Not by tanks in the streets, but by the threat that if you don't straighten things out pretty quickly, we might intervene. This had a very interesting effect. It convinced younger members of this party, which had various names, but I think at the time it was called the Virtue Party, to decide that if there was a future for political Islam in Turkey, they had to get rid of the old guys who were too strident, too kind of prone to push the buttons that got the military and the secularists really upset. And they had to present themselves as more effective at doing what the secularists wanted done, better at running the economy, less corrupt. This is the beginning of a big theme of the old system allowed for a lot of patronage. You know, the state-run industries could always favor this group or that group, and it led to a lot of corruption. So the young members of this Islamist party decided, we're going to come to power, if we ever do so, by showing that we can govern at the local elections. So let's go win the municipalities and the local elections. And then let's do a good job at that level and not be corrupt. And then gradually we can build our reputation, and in time we will have a chance to win at the national level. So one of these young leaders was a guy from very modest background who had spent his youth as a seller of little, if you've ever been in Turkey, you see these things, they look like kind of round pretzels that are sold on the streets, called simit. That's what he did as a kid. And then he made a reputation as a soccer player, and then he got active in local politics, and he eventually got himself elected mayor of Istanbul. And he was a very effective mayor, including, this was a time of enormous urbanization, people flocking into the city from the countryside, and he welcomed them and found them places to live and schools for them. And you know, these are people who didn't even know how to exist in an urban area. And this mayor, with his sensitivities to popular opinion and Islamic sensibilities, helped to integrate this whole wave of people into the urban way of life that they were coming to enjoy, because that's where the money was. And this man was the current Prime Minister, Recep Tayyip Erdogan. Erdogan was a little bit controversial as a mayor. There was a brief moment when he was convicted of using inflammatory language and was put in prison, but was eventually released. And by that time, his national reputation was quite impressive. So in his party's first bid for power in 2002, and we're really now talking about the past 10 years, 10, 12 years of Turkish politics have been dominated by this party and this man. So in 2002, his party, it's called the AK Party, the Justice and Development Party, ran under a new set of electoral rules. And this was a very stringent electoral law, which was designed to keep very small parties from getting seats in the parliament. It was because you had a very fragmented political system in the 1990s with lots of little parties that could shift allegiances and unsettle coalitions. So the idea was that you'd make it very hard for the little parties to even get into parliament. So unless you got 10% of the vote, you wouldn't get any seats at all. So in this particular vote, the AK party, that is Erdogan's party, with 34% of the popular vote, ended up getting about 2/3 of the seats in parliament. And the Ataturkist party, which got about 20% of the vote, got about half of that. So this is the beginning of a period when Erdogan has remarkable power in his hands. Now, it's true that the military is still there looking over his shoulder, and all the early pictures, and even today, if you see a picture of Erdogan, he's always sure to make sure that a portrait of Ataturk is on the wall behind him. But there clearly was going to be some kind of reckoning between these two, the military and Erdogan. And then the judiciary has always been somewhat independent. So periodically, they could step in and rule certain of his decisions to be illegal. Just to look at the electoral scorecard, the AK party, just look at the popular vote after the AK line there. In 2002, they get 34% of the popular vote. In 2007, they get 47% of the popular vote. In 2011, they get almost 50% of the popular vote. This is quite remarkable. Don't pay so much attention to the number of seats because the rules change a bit. A party in power does better each time it goes back to the polls. Now, something's got to be going pretty well to get that kind of a mandate. And what was going well was this was a decade where Turkey was frequently pointed to as one of the success stories economically. The economy started booming. I used to go to Turkey in the 1980s, and you could see it was a little bit better off than Egypt or Syria or others in the region, but it was quite recognizable as a country that was still struggling with a lot of economic problems, and countryside was still fairly poor. The 1990s begins to see fairly dramatic change, and then in the 2000s, Turkey starts growing at 8, 9, 10% a year. Turkish workers are going to Germany, learning skills in German car factories, sending money back home, eventually coming back home, working in industries. And Turkey becomes an exporter of goods for the Middle East. It becomes skilled in construction. It starts rebuilding its own cities. It has a big market of its own. And then with the collapse of the Soviet Union, all of Central Asia, which is Turkish-speaking, Turkish, sort of opens up as a potential market for Turkish entrepreneurs. And this is a great time for Turkish businessmen. They start making money like there's no tomorrow. And you begin to get a group of so-called Islamist entrepreneurs, people who start making money in the countryside and bringing prosperity to their home districts. They're still rooted in the conservative values that they grew up with, but they're very much part of the international economy. Some people began to think that the AK party's time was coming to an end because of the recent criticisms and scandals. But just to tell you one more electoral point, is municipal elections were held just a few weeks ago. And a lot of people thought that with all the criticisms of Erdogan, that his party would not do so as well. It didn't do as well as in these parliamentary elections, but they did much better than they had done in previous municipal elections. They got about 45% of the vote again, despite everything that's been going on, which I'll tell you about in a moment. So the AK party and Erdogan are still very, very popular. This is a picture of Erdogan with Ataturk behind him. And this is his headscarfed wife, who cannot actually go into government buildings with him, at least wasn't able to under laws up until about a year ago, because under the secular laws that Ataturk had put in place, headscarved women in official roles could not be in a government building. If you were elected to parliament, you could not wear a headscarf. Now you couldn't go to a state university if you wore a headscarf. That's beginning to erode, it's beginning to change, but this is another example of this tension between the more secular institutions, which are embedded in the judiciary, for example, and popular opinion, which says these should be personal choices and not mandated by the government. The other figure in the party who has helped to set it up and make it what it is today is a somewhat less charismatic and dramatic character, but he is also a significant figure. He's Abdullah Gül, who is the current president. The president actually has less power than the prime minister. But I mention him because the current prime minister, Erdogan, is not supposed to run for prime minister again. There are going to be elections next year, and according to his party rules, he has to step down. And some people think that he's going to switch places with the current president. That is, he will run for president. There are presidential elections this year in August, that Gül will not run again, and that for the first time there will be popular elections of the president, and that Erdogan will present himself, will almost certainly get elected if he wants to be, even though the powers of the presidency are constitutionally less impressive than those of the prime minister. But if Erdogan becomes president, he will take some of those powers with him, probably. Gül would then become prime minister in his place. They would just switch places, sort of like what Putin and Medvedev did in Russia. Hasn't happened, but if it does, you will have seen the next prime minister here, but he's currently the president. This is probably the person that you have never heard of, unless you are very attentive, who plays the most significant role in Turkey other than the two people I just mentioned. And he also lives in the United States. This is a very curious character who in the 1980s and 90s began a social movement in Turkey designed to bring people in touch with their Islamic roots. He set up schools, he set up scholarship funds, he made a lot of money by investing in Central Asia and the new Turkish republics after the collapse of the Soviet Union. And he presented himself as a non-political figure. But we have a tape of him from about 1990 in which he talks to his followers who were very devoted to him. And he says, the key to our influence is to infiltrate the state agencies and to gain control in the police and in the judiciary and in the military, because these are the keys to power. And if we are well placed in those institutions, we will have great influence in the future. And there's every reason to believe that, to some extent, that happened. His followers did, in fact, spend a good bit of time in the next couple of decades joining the police, military, judiciary. And when the AK party came to power, Gulen was an ally. He helped to bring the state apparatus into alignment with the AK party. So it was a big source of support for this consolidation of power around an Islamist prime minister. Oddly enough, he has been living in rural Pennsylvania since about 1990, when there were rumors that he was going to be accused of violating some Turkish law, and he just left the country and claimed it was for health reasons. But he is still living in rural Pennsylvania. You ever heard of the guy? Probably 4 or 5 of you have. But anybody ever seen him? He never appears on American television, but he still has this network. The current prime minister and he have now split. They've split decisively, and Erdogan is now blaming him for everything that's going wrong in the country. And he says it's all a foreign conspiracy. He sits there in the United States. The Americans know what he's doing. They have to be permitting it and perhaps encouraging it. And it has created a great storm in Turkey itself. So that's there's a beginning of this split within the Islamist movement, and it's largely Erdogan versus this guy, and he's now claiming that indeed he did infiltrate the police and the military and the judiciary, and that this is why Erdogan is now striking back at these institutions and claiming that they're trying to undermine the current government. Well, this brings us pretty much up to date. In the past year, politics has really spun out of control in Turkey. About a year ago, you may have seen demonstrations over what looked like a small issue in Turkey. I was in Turkey in May of last year, about 2 weeks after I left. Demonstrators went out to protest against the prime minister's plan to renovate a part of downtown Istanbul that had a small little park that I used to walk through every day, almost nobody in the park, but it was one of the very few green spaces in the city, and so all the environmentalists, all 200 or 300 of them, went crazy and said he's going to ruin our beautiful park. And it became a test of strength between the prime minister, who's, when he makes up his mind, he really doesn't tolerate dissent, and all of the disaffected people who didn't like being told what to do, who went to bat for what was called Gezi Park, this little park that was next to the hotel I was staying in. And it became a big deal. There were street demonstrations. The police got pretty heavy-handed, lots of tear gas. Not many casualties, but enough to create a real sense of grievance. And that sort of tension in the political system hasn't ebbed since. The country is much more polarized than it's been in a long time. The economy is actually slowing down. And we now face this moment of possible transition with Erdogan either running for president or perhaps even seeking a 4th term as prime minister, although that would require some change of rules. One of the things that Erdogan has done, which shows he's a very shrewd politician, is as he has seen his Islamist base erode, he has reached out to the Kurdish minority. A very smart man. You can't alienate everybody at the same time in politics if you want to survive. And so about 2 years ago, he and his intelligence people started secretly negotiating with the imprisoned head of the most militant Kurdish movement. He's in a prison on a little island in the Marmara Sea. And they reached an agreement with him that the so-called PKK, the armed Kurdish group inside the country, would remove its arms from the country. They'd actually go physically to Iraqi Kurdistan. They would be allowed to leave with their families if they wanted. People who stayed behind would be given amnesty. And Kurdish cultural rights, for example, you can't teach Kurdish in Turkish schools, even in Kurdish areas. Those rights would be changed. They would be given the right to use their language in schools, broadcasting, on television, even in the parliament. If a Kurdish deputy in parliament dares to speak Kurdish even today, it's a real no-no. But basically, Erdogan is saying, all of these things are possible if you support me against both the secularists, who are very anti-Kurdish, and the Islamists that are on the wrong side of this argument. And so it looks as if Erdogan is building support in that constituency for his presidential bid, because with support from the Kurds and his own party, he gets 50% of the vote. So I think we're still in an era when Erdogan is going to be the dominant force, but I must say the last couple of months have been hard for him. There have been leaks from within the security services of tapes that almost certainly are authentic, that have him talking to his son about money in a way that makes it sound very much as if there's personal corruption at stake, if not serious institutional corruption. They've had tapes from the most sensitive parts of the security bureaucracy being leaked about trying to create incidents on the Syrian border that will justify the Turkish military intervening, that is creating a pretext for a more aggressive Turkish role in Syria, which a lot of Turks don't want to see their country get drawn into the conflict there. And it is creating a lot of tension in the country. Erdogan's supporters say that they're fabricated, they're not real, but my Turkish friends who've listened to them say they sound pretty real to them. So there is a kind of, if not quite crisis atmosphere in the country. There's a lot more political tension than there has been for a long time. But having said that, if any of you are tempted to go to Turkey in the near future, you're still going to find it by regional standards, a remarkably impressive, well-run country where people are allowed to express their dissent and are not immediately arrested for doing so. So it's getting to the point where journalists are getting a little bit worried. But it's a remarkable place to visit. It has a remarkable history. And with all of the difficulties that I've described of their current situation, I think that Turks on the whole have learned that sticking with democracy, not relying on the military to intervene, is the better way to go. So I'm still moderately optimistic about Turkey's future. I'm going to stop my remarks at this point and invite your comments and questions.
Wow. That's a great presentation, Bill, for bringing us not only the past history, but up to date. And it asks a couple of questions. The two parts of my question would be, what is our current relationship then with Erdogan? And based on the one individual in Pennsylvania and the split now with him, and does Turkey have an influence in the Middle East with Syria or with any of the other portions where we could ask for their help in going through and helping further our cause or the cause of those countries?
It's an excellent question, Jim. The first trip that President Obama made in 2009 to the Middle East was to Turkey. And it was to demonstrate, I think, that the United States had a solid ally and friend in the Middle East. He made a real effort to reach out to Erdogan. And certainly for the first 2 or 3 years, that is through about 2012, maybe into 2013, I would have characterized the U.S.-Turkish relationship as excellent. Obama and he would talk on the phone, they would coordinate. Turkish troops were fighting side by side with us in Afghanistan. We were coordinating policies on a whole series of issues. that has begun to break down. And it's partly, I don't know, I think Syria is an issue where we both want to see change. We want to see the Assad regime replaced, but tactically there have been some differences. There have been some resentment in official Washington that Erdogan has kind of played this card of foreign intervention, implying that the United States and Israel are somehow trying to destabilize the country. And so the warmth has gone out of the relationship. We still have cooperation across a fairly broad spectrum. It's not, this issue of the guy in Pennsylvania is not a big issue. There's no support from the American government for him, but he does his thing. But I would say today it's a less cooperative relationship, although it has not become too strained. As far as Turkey's role in the Middle East, right now it doesn't look like it's going so well. Syria is a mess, and there's not very much that Turkey can do about it other than hope that the problem doesn't spill over any more than it already has. There are some hundreds of thousands, maybe almost 1 million Syrians who have fled into Turkey, which puts a huge human burden on the southern parts of the country. The relationship between Turkey and Israel is still strained, although that seems to be under some repair right now. Turkey had a very close relationship with the former government in Egypt, and so with its ouster, it's not on very good terms with Egypt. It has a remarkably good relationship with the Kurdish Republic, or the Kurdish Autonomous Area of Iraq, but not with the Iraqi government. But it's very odd that the one good relationship they have on their borders is with the neighboring Kurdish area of Iraq. And they have good relations with the one success story of the Arab Spring, Tunisia, which is now almost emulating Turkey in terms of its steps toward constitutional revision, elections, democracy, and so forth. So it's very much a mixed picture, but the idea of Turkey as the kind of pulling together the remnants of the old Ottoman Empire and being a model for all of them, that's not happening.
Good. Do we have any other questions? Please, yes.
Thank you. I have two questions. From your point of view, how do you, I don't want to touch it. How much closer? From your point of view, or maybe from the US point of view, how do you see Turkey's chances for joining the EU as a permanent member, which it at one point wanted to do, I understand? And secondly, how do you see the relationship of the Turkish military vis-à-vis Erdogan, who, as you described, has shown quite some erratic behavior and seems to be lashing out, reacting at the moment, like blocking Twitter, right, blocking Facebook, right, that kind of thing?
Again, excellent questions. The prospect of joining the European Union had a tremendous impact on Turkey in the 1990s and early 2000s. In order to become a member of the European Union, which seemed to have all kinds of advantages, Turkey would have to improve its human rights record. They had to abolish the death penalty. A whole lot of Europe has certain criteria for member states. And so as they accepted Turkey as a possible candidate member, they also said, here are your benchmarks. If you want to become a member, here's what you have to do. And in all honesty, Europeans were deeply divided over the wisdom of having Turkey as a member. The moment Turkey joins the European Union, if it ever does, it becomes the single largest populated state in the European Union. And a lot of people say, wait a minute, that's not what we set out to be, to have our largest state a Muslim state. And there's no two ways about it. It is their cultural identity that is the problem. In economic terms, Turkey is more developed than Bulgaria. Bulgaria is welcomed into the European Union, but Bulgaria is fundamentally Christian in its origins. So Islam is an issue, and in 2006, the Europeans made it pretty clear that it would be a very, very long time, if ever. And this was largely Angela Merkel and the French, who said, we're not going to rush to make it easy for Turkey to become a member. They can have many of the privileges of membership, but full membership, no. And at that point, Erdogan, who had been, I think, eager to show that he could be catering both to his Muslim constituency and his more modern secular constituency, basically said, we don't need the Europeans all that much. The economy's doing fine. We're selling tons of our products to the Middle East now. We have more or less free trade agreements with all of Europe. So what's left for us to gain? If they don't want us, we don't need them. And that's kind of where things stand today. I think what really bothered the Turks was that Cyprus was allowed into the European Union, even though Cyprus is divided, as you know, and the northern part of it is occupied by Turkish troops. Turkey recognizes something called the Turkish Republic of Cyprus, but Cyprus as a unified whole, without a reconciliation between the Turkish and Greek parts, was allowed into the European Union, and Cyprus now has a say on whether Turkey gets in. And guess what? They're not going to say yes. So this is sort of on hold for now, and I think will be for a very long time. The role of the military. About the mid-2000, 2005, 2006, the Erdogan government claimed that a major plot had been unraveled that included people in the military, in the secret services, in the financial realm, and in the judiciary. And that this was like planning for another military coup. And a large number of officers were arrested, were put on trial, tremendous number of documents were found. To this day, it is hard for anyone to know how much truth there is. Something was going on. There's no doubt that something was going on. Whether it was a full-fledged conspiracy or whether there were some rather extreme people talking about what might be done, but there was enough to it that this was turned over to the judiciary, and hundreds of military officers and police officers and judges and journalists were brought before the judiciary and accused of participation in what was called the Ergenekon, or sledgehammer plot. And the result of this was a huge purge of the upper echelons of the military, most of whom have not been replaced. And today's military is a shadow of its former self. It's much more under civilian control, as far as we know. And Erdogan, oddly enough, is now claiming that the Gulen people were the ones who promoted the purge, that they were the ones who claimed that they knew all of these people who were plotting, and they gave the names to the judiciary and to the government. And he's now raising questions about whether all of it was justified. And he's going through a kind of reconciliation with some of the people who were accused and saying, well, we're going to drop the charges. And again, it shows there's a kind of political judgment at work here, that he can't offend everybody all at once. But for the moment, most people whom I know think that the Turkish military is not in a position to step in politically, that it's just not going to happen. But I don't have an independent judgment on that. But it's been since 1980 that the tanks have rolled in the streets, and I don't think they'll be out anytime soon. We have time for maybe one more?
One more question, Mike.
There's been some evidence recently of some distancing between President Gül and Erdogan, particularly over sort of the crackdown on the protesters,
Right.
and also on these draconian measures with respect to Twitter and Facebook and that sort of thing. How would you characterize that relationship? I mean, many in the West are thinking that, or are saying that Gül should not go along with Erdogan's plans.
Yes, it's very interesting. The people who don't like Erdogan in the West typically like Gül. They think he's more moderate, that he's kind of more reasonable, he's more open to compromise. The problem is he's not nearly as popular in Turkey as Erdogan. Erdogan is popular because pounds the podium and he speaks the language of the street. And people say he's quite a good speaker. I can't verify because I don't understand Turkish, but people say he's very effective when he gets up on a podium and he makes all these charges that sound outrageous to us. They really go over well with his constituents. Gül is a much milder-mannered man. He doesn't have anything like the same reputation, but people who know him like him. He's a nice guy, and he is more moderate. He also is closer to the Gülen movement, interestingly. And Erdogan is not so personally close to them, obviously now isn't at all. So I think if Gül were to become the prime minister with the current prime minister's powers, a lot of people in the United States and in the West would say, that's good. You know, Erdogan's becoming a problem. He's a little too tensed up. He's, you know, he needs to take his Valium or something and get himself a little calmed down. He's overexcited. But I'm not so sure that the Erdogan era is over yet. I think we saw a lot of verbal excess, partly because he was playing to the constituency that just went to the voting boxes, and it worked. He got more votes than anybody expected. Typically, Erdogan in the past, when he would kind of overdo it, would find a way to kind of back off a little bit and rebuild some of these bridges, and that may now take place. We don't know. It also may be that he's just thinks he's done so well for so long that he can do anything he wants. But there's no question that in popular terms, he is the more popular figure of the two.
Thank you very much, Dr. Quandt. This has been excellent. We appreciate your sharing your expertise with us, both on Egypt and in Turkey. Thanks again.